The Battle of Dorylaeum was won, but victory came with a cost the Crusaders had never imagined. As the dust of battle settled, the once thundering field fell into a dead silence, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the groans of dying horses. The smell of sweat, iron, and smoke clung to the air as the Crusaders looked out across the wasteland they had carved with their swords. They had survived. But survival was only the beginning. The morning after the battle, the sun rose harsh and merciless. Armor burned under its heat. Wounds festered. Men collapsed from thirst before they even started marching again. The Crusaders expected glory in Asia Minor. What they found instead was a world trying to kill them. The Seljuks did not return to fight in the open. Instead, they became shadows. They burned wells ahead of the Crusader path. They poisoned what water remained. Their riders circled at a distance, loosing arrows into the dust, cutting down any straggler who fell behind. The Crusaders marched with shields overhead, not against swords, but against the unforgiving sky. The heat was a weapon. The land itself was an enemy. Children fainted. Pilgrims died quietly beside the road. Knights walked beside their horses, too exhausted to ride. Dry rivers became mass graves, where the weakest simply lay down and never rose again. Hunger became a torment deeper than fear. Some boiled leather, some chewed grass, some prayed that death would come quickly. Even the great leaders, Bohemond, Godfrey, Raymond, felt the strain. Alliances cracked. Accusations spread like disease through the camp. But still, they pushed forward, bound by a single shared obsession: Jerusalem. Every step deeper into Anatolia tested them. Every mile stripped away one more piece of their strength. The march after Dorylaeum became more than a journey. It became a trial of the soul. The Crusaders pressed deeper into Anatolia, following roads that had once carried caravans and armies, now nothing more than broken paths scattered with the remains of those who had tried to cross before them. For miles, the only markers were bones. The Seljuks had not stopped fighting. They had simply changed the battlefield. They let the land fight for them. The Crusaders entered valleys where the heat sat like a weight on the shoulders, where the wind carried nothing but dust and the faint stench of death. Some days, the air shimmered so fiercely that the horizon seemed to melt, but they marched anyway. Every morning began the same, waking to bodies that hadn't survived the night. Sometimes friends, sometimes strangers, sometimes pilgrims who had traveled thousands of miles only to fall in the dirt, unseen and unremembered. No songs were sung now, no shouts of encouragement, only the measured crunch of exhausted feet on a dying earth. Food became scarcer than hope. Knights traded armor pieces for scraps of grain. Mules dropped mid-march. Some men forced themselves forward with empty eyes, driven by faith alone. On the worst days, the Seljuks returned, not in full force, but as phantoms on horseback. They appeared on distant hills, riding silently, their silhouettes flickering against the burning sky. Then, like a whip crack, arrows rained down, striking from nowhere. The Crusaders never knew when the next attack would come. Every man walked with his shield half raised, every second expecting death. But even in this misery, they found strange moments of unity. When a child fainted, knights lifted them onto horses. When water was discovered, even a trickle, it was shared in silence, each sip treated like gold. When someone collapsed, others carried them, until they couldn't anymore. These hardships did something the Seljuks could not. They stripped away pride, rank, and division. What remained was a single, hardened mass: soldiers, pilgrims, nobles, peasants, marching as one. After weeks of suffering, the land began to change. Green returned. Streams flowed again. Villages appeared, abandoned but standing. The Crusaders felt something they hadn't felt since leaving Nicaea: relief. Morale rose. Wounds healed. Men who had forgotten how to smile began to laugh again. For the first time in months, they could breathe. But this recovery also brought something else, something colder: reality. The closer they came to Antioch and the Holy Land, the clearer the truth became. The hardest battles were still ahead. The Seljuks had failed to break them, with hunger and heat. But beyond the hills lay cities with walls so high they touched the clouds: Antioch, and farther still, Jerusalem. Two fortresses capable of swallowing armies whole. And as the Crusaders stood before the rising hills, feeling the air cool and the grass return beneath their feet, they understood something deeper than fear. Their journey was not nearing its end. It was only changing shape. Ahead of them waited challenges greater than deserts or hunger. Challenges that would test not their bodies, but their resolve. The march continued. The road wound onward, and destiny marched with them. But even as the land softened beneath their feet, as streams trickled and birds returned to the sky, the march did not lose its tension. Because on the morning of the 41st day since Dorylaeum, the Crusaders reached the crest of a final ridge, and there, spread out before them, stood the city that had haunted their dreams and prayers: Antioch, a vast giant of stone and legend, a city older than Rome, a fortress girded with walls that stretched for miles, climbing mountainsides and vanishing into the clouds. For a long moment, the entire army stopped walking. Men who had spent weeks staring only at dust now stared at towers that pierced the sky. Pilgrims fell to their knees. Knights removed their helmets, letting the cool air touch their scarred faces. And even hardened veterans, men who had seen death up close, whispered under their breath. Because this was no ordinary city. It was the gateway to the Holy Land. The road behind them was suffering, but the road ahead was destiny. Slowly, the army descended the ridge, spreading out across the plain. Standards rose again. Horses were saddled properly, armor polished, swords checked. The Crusaders, once half-dead wanderers, now looked like an army reborn. Hope did that to men. For the first time since they had left Nicaea, commanders spoke with confidence, plotting, marking positions, assigning watch. They knew they could not take Antioch by storm. Few cities on earth could be. So the plan was simple and terrifying. Besiege the city, starve it, break it, and if necessary, die before abandoning the campaign. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the Crusaders made camp on the plains before Antioch's gates. Fires flickered across the darkening field. Priests walked through the ranks offering blessings. Scouts returned with maps of the walls, each report more daunting than the last. Yet no one faltered, because for all its towers and battlements, Antioch represented more than stone. It was the first true test of the Crusade, the first promise they could fulfill to the world that waited behind them. And as night fell, a strange quiet settled on the plain. Not fear, not exhaustion, but anticipation. Tomorrow the siege would begin. Tomorrow, the dream of the Holy Land would take its first real step forward. And every man knew what happened at Antioch would decide the fate of the entire crusade. The sun rose on the Crusaders' first morning before Antioch, casting long shadows across the valley. For a moment, the beauty of the land almost made them forget why they had come. Antioch glowed in the early light, its gardens spilling across the hillsides, its orchards lush and untouched, its rivers weaving silver paths toward the distant sea. From afar, the city looked less like a fortress and more like a dream. But the walls told the truth. They rose like cliffs of stone, towering over the landscape, unmatched by anything the Crusaders had seen on their long march. Dozens of towers crowned the heights, watching over every approach. And on the mountains above the city, more walls coiled upward like a serpent. The famous Iron Gate, the Citadel, and the fortress that crowned Mount Silpius. Antioch wasn't just defended, it was designed to break armies. Still, the Crusaders didn't hesitate. They spread across the green plains, driving stakes into the earth, raising tents, sharpening spears. Smiths struck metal. Commanders paced between the ranks, and every man, whether knight or pilgrim, felt the weight of what this siege would mean. It had begun. The first task was simple: lock the city down. Scouting parties rode out to seize the surrounding villages. Foraging groups gathered wood, water, and food from the fertile land. Forts were planned. Roads were blocked. Every path leading into Antioch had to be watched. But this city was no passive giant. From the towers, Muslim archers fired warning shots. From the gates, scouts rushed out to report on Crusader movements. And across the battlements, signals flashed from tower to tower, the defenders preparing for war. Inside the Crusader camp, a sense of awe mingled with dread. Many had dreamed of reaching the Holy Land, but no one had imagined that their first great test would be this city, a city that looked as if it had been carved from legend. Yet even in the face of its size and strength, the Crusaders felt a growing energy. They had survived deserts. They had survived hunger. They had survived ambushes and exhaustion and death. Now they stood in a land of rivers and green hills, staring at the prize that would open the road to Jerusalem. The siege of Antioch had begun, and with it, the true heart of the crusade. The first days of the siege brought hope, but it did not last. What the Crusaders found before them was not just a city, it was a fortress carved into the earth, wrapped in walls that seemed impossible to climb, and guarded by towers that watched every movement from below. And as the days stretched into weeks, something began to crack, not in the walls of Antioch, but among the leaders of the crusade themselves. The unity forged in the deserts of Anatolia began to fade. At the council tent, arguments erupted almost daily. Bohemond pressed for control of the city once it fell, a demand that angered the princes who believed the crusade belonged to God, not to the ambitions of a single Norman lord. Raymond of Toulouse accused others of chasing glory instead of victory. Godfrey pushed for discipline and order, but his voice was often drowned by pride and suspicion. The smaller lords grumbled that the great princes hoarded resources while common soldiers starved. Every decision, where to attack, how to build siege towers, who controlled the foraging parties, became a battle in itself. The Crusaders had marched across half the world together, but now, with the goal finally in sight, their unity began to unravel. Even the rank and file could feel the tension. Rumors raced through the camp like sparks in dry grass. Bohemond wants Antioch for himself. Raymond refuses to listen. Godfrey will not fight under another prince. No one leads us. Everyone commands. Each faction watched the others with wary eyes. Each leader believed he alone knew how to take the city. And all the while, Antioch loomed above them, silent, unbroken, indifferent. The Crusaders had come to fight the defenders of Antioch. But before long, they found themselves fighting their own doubts, their own allies, and the growing fear that pride might destroy them before the enemy could. While the Crusaders argued in their camp, Antioch itself had already begun to transform. Inside its colossal walls, the city braced for war. Yaghi, the Seljuk governor of Antioch, moved through the citadel like a man carrying the weight of an empire. He knew the Crusaders were not just another raiding army. They were a tide, relentless, swelling, and determined to take the city no matter the cost. So he prepared Antioch for a long, suffocating siege. Messengers raced through the streets, summoning every able-bodied man to the walls. Shops closed, markets emptied. Families retreated into the inner quarters of the city, carrying what food they could before the stores were seized for the garrison. Blacksmiths worked night and day, forging spearheads and arrow shafts until their hands blistered. Stonecutters shaped heavy blocks to be dropped from the battlements. Pitch was heated in great cauldrons on the towers, its fumes drifting through the air like a warning. From the highest minarets, scouts scanned the hills, watching the Crusader camps grow like patches of white fungi across the plain. Yaghi reinforced every gate, especially the Iron Gate, the westernmost entrance, and the city's proudest barrier. He had its great wooden beams strengthened with additional iron plates. Fresh chains were brought in. Archers were positioned so densely above it that their shadows darkened the courtyard below. But the preparations were not only military. Yaghi knew that fear could break a city faster than hunger. So he rallied the people. He spoke in the mosques, reminding them that Antioch had endured countless invaders across centuries, Romans, Persians, Byzantines, and survived them all. He assured the Christian and Armenian communities inside the city that they would remain safe under his protection, even as the Crusaders outside claimed to be their liberators. But trust was fragile. Some citizens whispered that the Franks would breach the walls. Others feared betrayal from within. Every night, Yaghi changed the guards on the towers, never trusting the same men twice. Inside the city, bread grew thinner. Crowds gathered at the wells, praying the water would hold out. Mothers soothed their crying children with stories of past sieges, stories in which Antioch always survived. Yet beneath the surface, the city was tightening like a drum. Antioch was ready. Its walls were armed. Its soldiers were watchful. And its people waited, suspended between hope and dread, knowing the storm was about to break. Weeks passed. What began as determination slowly became endurance, and then survival. The siege of Antioch, at first filled with hope, soon turned into a silent war of the mind. The Crusaders faced not only the towering walls of the city, but the collapse of their own strength. Food dwindled again. Foraging parties traveled farther and returned with less. Some never returned at all. The lush greenery that had welcomed them now offered nothing but empty branches and trampled earth. Every animal in the countryside had been hunted, every storehouse stripped. Hunger returned like an old enemy, the kind that gnaws at a man until he cannot sleep, cannot think, cannot pray. Cold winds rolled down from the mountains. Armor that once shone in the sun now felt like ice. At night, men huddled together, whispering about home, wondering if God had abandoned them, or if this was his final test. Inside the camp, despair took on strange forms. Some nights claimed to see visions, angels walking the hills, saints standing above the valley. Others spoke of curses, believing the land itself rejected them. Arguments broke out. Tents stood empty, laughter vanished, and every morning as the first arrows of the day fired from Antioch's walls, a cruel truth settled deeper in their hearts. The city was not weakening. They were The defenders inside Antioch still had food. They still had water. They still had the walls, the high towers, the mountain citadel that watched the Crusader camps like a silent, unblinking eye. The Crusaders were trapped between hope and starvation, between faith and fear, between the dream of Jerusalem and the reality that they might die before even touching Antioch's gates. Men began to wonder, not if they could win, but how long they could endure. The siege was no longer about swords or arrows. It became a battle inside the mind, a test of resolve, a test of purpose, a test of the soul itself. And this time, there was no desert to blame, no ambush, no phantom horseman, only the slow, crushing weight of time. Night fell over Antioch, and the sky turned a deep, haunting purple. In that fading light, the Crusader camp lay silent, fires flickering, tents trembling in the cold wind, shadows moving like ghosts among exhausted men. Ahead of them, the walls of Antioch rose untouched, towers glowing faintly under the violet sky, gates locked tight, a silent giant daring them to continue. This was the purple shot, the moment where history held its breath. Hunger gnawed, leaders clashed, fear spread, and yet none of them knew what was coming next. The betrayal, the miracle, and the battle that would change the crusade forever. Antioch was not weakening, it was only sharpening its teeth. The true test of the crusade had only begun. If you want to see the betrayals, the battles, and the miracle that turned the tide, make sure to like the video and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next.